We're on the bottom of, I'm sorry I interrupted. It's 13b4. We're on the bottom of 13b4. In the left column, the Gemara asks, Kates and Moilo, how does one rub the ears? So if you remember yesterday, we said that one is allowed to, on Yontif, take the stalks, rub them, crack them open to be able to get to the seeds. Says the Gemara, Kate said, Moilel, Abaye Mishmei Rav Yosef Amar, Abaye says in the name of Rav Yosef, Chado achado. You're allowed to rub one finger against another finger. You can't rub it like exactly the right way, but you're allowed to go like this, rub it like that. Rav Avi Mishmei Rav Yosef Amar, Chada Ba'atata. You could do one finger against two fingers. One finger against two fingers, which obviously is a better dealing of rubbing. Rava, even the Mishani, since already you're deviating from the regular way of rubbing the ears by only using one hand as opposed to two hands. You can even rub one finger against all the others. In other words, use your entire palm. And in fact, we're going to see. Because the Gemara also said you're allowed to fan it with your hands in order to get rid of the shaft, to separate the shaft from the good stuff. How do you do it? He fans, and now we're on today's daf. Yud Daled Amid Aleph 14a1. 14a1. What do? You're allowed to do it by by fanning it from the knuckles upwards, using your fingers but not your palms. On this, they laughed at him from the west, from Eretz Yisrael. They said, the Mishani, since already you're deviating from the usual thing, the usual way of separating shaft from the grains, by moving it from one hand to another hand, as opposed to using a sieve, which is of course the normal way of sifting between taking the bad from the good. Since I'm already only using my hands and not a mechanical device, I'm allowed to use my entire hand, even my palm. This is what I meant. He's allowed to fan with with one whole hand and with all the energy that you got. Right? You don't have to hold back. You can use your whole entire energy. Okay, great. Zok the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah. Give me 1 second, everybody. I'm going to find out if the nurse spoke to the agency to find out what's going on. Hold on 1 second. Hi. Okay, thank God she showed up. Jeff, can you hear me? Okay, you guys are good. Okay, Jerry, I'm sure you can hear me too. All right, let's keep going now. Now, until now, we were dealing with the actual food, and we said, okay, if it's food stuff, I'm entitled to have it on Yontif, which allowed me to bend the normal Shabbos rules that were being applied to Yontif and say, hey, l'tzairech achila, for the needs of eating, we put them aside, right? This is really what we've been discussing the last few dafim. What about the ancillary stuff? Spices, salt. You don't actually need them. They're not the actual food. But on the other hand, spice is the flavor of life. Food without spices, right? Don't give it much of a taste. So how do you handle the spices, especially in a world where you didn't go to the store and buy the spices off the shelf? You actually have to take a pestle and a mortar, put it in, and crush it. What's the problem with crushing? That's grinding. That's the malacha. That's one of the 39 malachas, one of the 39 actions of grinding. Grinding is an Isser d'Oraisa on Shabbos, and it's certainly not allowed normally on Yom Tov. So how am I going to allow you to grind spices and salt? Okay, and in what do you call it? How am I going to allow you to do it on Yom Tov? I have to come up with some way because you need it for your food, but I can't allow you to do it the normal way. So we got to come up with ways that change it. The one other thing to remember is how powerful salt is. Remember, before refrigeration, salt was an absolute necessity of life. Salt was the thing that you were used to refrigerate. Salt was the preserver. Everybody remembers vaguely Mahatma Gandhi, right? And the salt marches of India, right? Because salt was life. There was times when salt was more expensive than gold in the history of the world. So, anyways, let's go take a look at our Mishnah. So our Mishnah says we've got to come up with a way, but in we're coming up with a way, we've got to change. We have to make a shinoi, some sort of change, like in the same way that we got rid of the shaft, not by using a mechanical device, but using the hands. So it shows that there's a difference. Same thing over here too. Give me 1 second. That hits the spot. They Shammai Yomi. They Shammai says, Tablin. Tablin is spices. Spices, tablin, niduchin, v'modoich shel eitz. Spices are allowed to be crushed on Yom Tov in a wooden pestle. V'hamelach b'pach. But salt must be pounded either in an earthenware flask, ube'etza paror, or with a wooden mixing spoon. In other words, not in their normal, usual way. Ube'sil tablin spices, notchim kedarkan. Spices could be crushed in their usual way. You could use your regular pestle and mortar to crush spices because it's food. Food without spices is missing something. No good. In other words, b'modoich shel eben, with a stone pestle, u'b'melach, but salt, b'modoich shel eitz, I agree, has to be done at the very least in a wooden pestle. There has to be some change with regard to salt. So the Gemara says, comes the Gemara and says, listen, Beisham and Mesil are arguing in our Mishnah, but one thing is clear. When it comes to salt, they both agree that some sort of deviation, some sort of shinoi has to take place. So says the Gemara, do the Kuli Amamiyas, but at any rate, everybody agrees with Beisham and Mesil. Melach boy shinoi, salt requires some sort of change, some sort of deviation from its normal way of being crushed. My Tama, why is it that crushing salt on Yom Tov is more stringent than crushing spices on Yom Tov? at least according to Beis Hillel, which you're allowed to do in the normal manner, and according to Beis Shammai, you can't quite do it in the normal manner, but almost in the normal manner. Says the Gemara, Rav Huna and Rav Chisda. Chadam kol kederis kulon tzirichis melach. All cooked dishes require salt. There is no such thing as a dish without salt. You need your sodium quotient. The ain't kol kederis sort of tablet. Not all cooked dishes needed spices. Therefore, you knew that you were going to be cooking for Yontif. You should have had your salt already prepared because every dish needs salt. Spices, you didn't know that you were going to need the spices. Your wife tells you the morning of Yontif, hey, where's my spices? And you go, oh, you didn't tell me you needed it yesterday. So spices you could do the regular way or with a small deviation according to Beis Shammai. But salt, you should have known to have it ready from yesterday, from before Yontif, because every dish requires salt. That's one shot. One says, Kol tabla nafki tamon. All spices, the moment you crush the spice, it starts losing its flavor. The flavor starts disappearing. Like pulling a new car out of the lot. The moment you pull the new car out of your car lot, the car is already worth $3,000 less than what you paid for it. But salt never loses its flavor of being crushed. So, Smai Benayu, what exactly is the difference between the two of them? Here's the difference. Ike Benayu, the Yudiya Mai Kedeya Boyle Tafshule. If before Yontif, on Erev Yontif, he knew exactly which dish was going to get cooked on Yontif. So according to that, when he crushed the spices, he should have crushed them yesterday. Because he should have crushed them yesterday. Right? Because he knew, we're already on 14.8.2, he should have crushed those spices yesterday. Why? Because he knew that this was going to be the dish that he was going to need for Yontif. And that dish needs spices. So you should have done it yesterday. So you got to use a deviation. You got to use a shinoi. According to the second reason, right? According to the second reason, no. Spices begin losing their flavors upon being crushed. Doesn't matter. Now you needed the spices. That's it. When you crush them, you do it. It's not a problem. In other words, you didn't want to crush the spices early. If I crushed them yesterday, by today, the spices won't be as pungent because the strength of the spice will have disappeared upon being crushed. So therefore, obviously, just because I knew what dish to do yesterday, the spices first needed to be crushed today on Yontif. That you're allowed to do the regular way. Inami, or just the opposite, we're talking about saffron. Saffron is a spice that even when you crush it, it does not lose its flavor. It's like salt. In that case, if a person did not know before Yontif that he was going to need the spice saffron, obviously you're allowed to, according to the first way, which is if you knew, you should have crushed it the day before. In this case, I didn't know I was going to need to use this. I didn't know I was going to need to use this spice. So obviously, I first crushed it on Yontif when I knew I needed it. I could do it the regular way. But according to the second reason, which is that crushed spices lose their flavor, and therefore you can't crush them early. You got to crush them on the day that you need them. Saffron, that doesn't apply. Saffron is a spice, and if you crush it, it doesn't lose its power. So then you should have done it yesterday. Simple. Either way, the point is that if you could have done it yesterday, we're going to make you do it today in an unusual way. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, says the Gemara, Vaita Kol HaNidochin, everything that's crushed, Nidochin Kedarkin. I hold, it says Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, it could be crushed in the usual manner. Ve'afilu melach, even salt. But how can you say that? Because everybody, even Beis Hillel, holds that salt needs to have a deviation when it's being crushed on Yom Tov. Shmuel, Yehuda brought down Shmuel. Yehuda, what do you call it? His Shmuel is saying like this Tana in the explanation of the machloikis of the argument between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. The Tana, because we learned in a Baraisa, Rabbi Meir, Lo Yachlaku Beis Shammai Beis Hillel Anan Niduchim. Beis Shammai Beis Hillel did not disagree regarding spices that are crushed in Niduchim Kedarkon, that they're allowed to be crushed in their usual manner. Melachim Mohen. And since you're already crushing the spices, you can slap along the salt and crush the salt along with them. Because I'm already illegally crushing, I'm crushing spices, I can throw in the salt and crush it together with it. They're only arguing when you're coming to crush the salt by itself. As mutually exclusive. You got to make some small change and do it either in an earthenware flask or a wooden spoon. Litzali for roasting, but not for cooking. In other words, every Jewish meat, as you know, requires a lot of salt in order to get rid of the blood. If you ever ask a non-Jew who eats kosher meat, he always says, "Oh boy, your meats are so much saltier than ours," right? And the answer is because our meats are salted because we have to get rid of the blood. That's only when you cook. When you roast, you don't need to salt it so much because the fire itself of the roasting brings out the blood. It dries up the blood and makes the blood leave the meat. So you don't need as much salt. So roasted meat is never as salty as cooked meat. That's what he's saying over here. Beis Hillel says the chol dover, it can be crushed with anything. So says the Gemara, chol dover sakedatach. What are you talking about? There are many kalim that are muksa. Any utensils that are muksa you're allowed to use. Means for any purpose, even for cooking, they're allowed to be crushed in large quantities. So according to the Tana of this Beitzah, Beis Hillel allows you to crush and even large quantities in the regular way. Shmuel accepts this Tana version of the dispute and Memela rules accordingly. Very good. So in other words, in typical Beya, Mesechtes Beya, we've got a million different, well, not a million, but you get the point, many different versions on what the actual arguments are. Now comes the Gemara, Amalei Rav Acha Bardula Lebrei. Rav Acha Bardula said to his son, when you crush the salt, Atzli Atzluche V'doik. Lean the mortar on its side and crush. In other words, go ahead. The truth is, I hold like Shmuel. It's all good. Nonetheless, I'd like you to make a small deviation. Put it on. Don't lay it flat. Lay it sideways and crush it that way. Don't be so flippant. It's Yom Tov. Let's not make this in some way change it from the regular uvda dechol, from the normal way that it's done. Rav Sheshes Shama Kol Buchno. On Yom Tov, Rav Sheshes heard the sound of a stone pestle pounding salt in a light mortar of stone, which is the usual way of crushing salt. Omar, he said, Hi la megavi debiseyu. This is not coming from my house, because I instructed my family not to crush salt in the normal way. So says the Gemara of Dilma Atzluyatzle, but maybe what he heard was being leaned on its side. Maybe they were making a shina, a deviation, by leaning the mortar on its side. Says the Gemara, the Shamid Avitzoli Kali. He heard the sound was clear. The pounding sound was clear, which meant that it wasn't that the keli, the utensil, the mortar was not being held sideways, was being held the normal way. We're now up to 1483. 1483. Vidilma Talvin Havil. But perhaps it was spices that were being crushed, which we said before. On Yontif, you're allowed to do them in the completely the usual way. Says the Gemara, Tavlin Gube Minabe Kalayu. Minabach Kalayu. Spices make a loud sound when they're pounded. The sound that Rav Shea just heard was not so loud, so he knew that it was salt that was being pounded, that was being crushed. And then he said, it's not being done the way I wanted it, with some sort of shidui, so it can't be coming from my house. Okay, very nice. Tanu Rabbanon, Ein Oisin Tisni. There's a dish called Tisni. The article explains it. It's grits made from wheat kernel that are split into quarters. Since pounding them into quarters involves extra effort above the normal effort, is usher on yontif. Okay, is not that becomes usher on yontif. Okay, because it's called a tayrach gadol, a great effort, something that requires great effort. That already we're not going to allow you to do on yontif. It's one thing to allow you to do things on yontif, specifically with regard to any food situation, but not if you've got to go ahead and put in a great amount of effort. So the Gemara over here says, Tanu Rabbanan, ein oisin tisni, ve'ein koishte machteshes. And we may not crush in a mortar on yontif. So the Gemara says, Tarte, wait a minute, that's contradictory. You first said, ein oisin tisni. You first say you're not allowed to make tisni on yontif, and then you say you're not allowed to crush it in a mortar, but mashma from them, in a mortar I'm not allowed to crush it, but I'm allowed to crush it a different way. In a different manner. So make up your mind. Am I not allowed to make it, or am I allowed to make it, but in a different manner, in an unusual manner? So hachikama, my time ain't noise and tisney. What's the reason why you can't make tisney? Because you can't crush it in a mortar, and by not crushing it in a mortar, you really can't cut it into quarters, and by definition, you're not gonna be able to make it. Says the Gemara, then just say very simple, you're not allowed to crush in a mortar. And I would know that means you can't make tisni on yontif. Why did you have to say specifically, ein oisin tisni, the ein koshim machteshes? That's a lot of extra words. Says the Gemara, if we had only said you're not allowed to crush in a mortar, I might have thought. That's only with regard to a large mortar, because then it looks like a production. It looks like you're going to work and producing spices, you're producing this tisney on a large thing, which of course you can't do on yontif. But a small mortar, I might have said is good, because then it's clear I'm only doing it for one day for yontif. Kamash Malon, that no. Says the Gemara, Tanya, but we learned in a Beitzah, Ein Choishin b'machteshes gedola. You're not allowed to crush in a large mortar, but you are able b'machteshes b'machteshes ketani. You are allowed to crush in a small mortar. So how could you explain before that Kamash Malon that you're not allowed to make your teeth in even in a small mortar, when here it clearly says you're allowed to? So Gemara says you're right. Elamai, here's the shot. Where the first price that taught that you're not allowed to crush in a mortar on yontif, it's teaching only with regard to a large mortar. Tisni, however, may not be made on yontif even in a small mortar. Tisni is a little different. Tisni, because it's got to be cut into quarters, has an additional problem of the probability of Tairach Gadol, of a major effort. Major effort is a problem in itself, having nothing to do with our problem of grinding, of crushing. It has a much greater problem of Tircha Gedoyla, which I do not allow you to do on Yontif. We're now on 14b1. 14b1. Rava gives a different explanation, right? The first price does say you're not allowed to crush what it goes in any way, even in a small mortar. Was like we originally explained, what it goes the way it holds, you're not allowed to make tisney or any, because we do not crush anything even in a small mortar. Like Kasha, what about the second Baraisa? That says you are allowed to crush in a small mortar. Halon, halahu. The second Baraisa that says you're allowed to in a small mortar applies is according to us who live in Babylon, who live in Bavel. The one who say you can't use a small mortar are those who live in Eretz Yisrael. What's the difference? So look at the third line of Rashi from the top, because in Eretz Yisrael they were better people. Best of the mention, as we say in Yiddish, the Islahu Avdi. They had slaves, the Mizalzeh Ba'oisig Gedoyla, who were Mizalzel, and they actually pounded in big mortars, which everybody agrees is no good on Yom Tov. And they would lie, V'ketana Shaninu, and when challenged, they would say, no, we produced it in small mortars. And Taisvis on top, the little Taisvis right on top, Ravam, La'ila my Tamkama. What's the reason? Ushum Kenisha Loishari Apilu Biketano. And the reason is Umayri Lol of Nei Eretz Yisrael. We're talking about the people from Eretz Yisrael. Sheyesh Lam Avodim, who have servants. Shemizalzim B'dova Kach Pirish Kunchitz. That's the way Rashi explained it. So the truth is, you are allowed to use a small mortar. The first price that says you're not allowed to is because we know who does the servants in the kitchen, which in Eretz Yisrael there were better people. They had household help. So they had the money for household help. The household help would really prepare it in large mortars, which everybody agrees on Yom Tov is no good. And when challenged, would lie and say it was done in a katana. So Mamela, they asked it in Eretz Yisrael, crushing anything on Yom Tov. Mashen came in Babel. They didn't have the money for servants. They were doing it themselves. They knew that only in a small mortar and not a large mortar. Good. Rav Papi Iklai Lebei Mar Shmuel. Rav Papi visited the house of Mar Shmuel on Yom Tov. Aizile Daisa. They brought him the dish known as Daisa. Okay? V'loy Achel. He did not eat it because the grains have been crushed on Yom Tov in a mortar. V'dilma Machtevish Ketanavu. This Gemara says, why? Maybe they crushed it in a small mortar, which is allowed on Yom Tov. So the Gemara, Papi saw the Chazid Abidai Kitfei that it was pounded very fine. So it must have been pounded in a large mortar. V'dilma Meyas Malavuda, but maybe it was done yesterday. Maybe they prepared it on yesterday on Erev Yom Tov, so there's no problem. The Chazid Abikolim Tzahare, he saw that the kernels still had white streaks, which means they had been peeled and crushed just now today. The Iba Yasema, that the truth of the matter is they did make the Disa in a small mortar. And normally it should be allowed. Shani Bey Mar Shmuel, but the house of Mar Shmuel was different. The Ika Piritzu Sadabde, because they had the problem of servants. Rapapi was worried that his servants were not going to pay much attention to Jewish law, and behind his back prepare it in a large mortar, and then tell us that it's only in a small mortar. So therefore he said, I'm not having it on Yom Tov. Perfect. Okay, next Mishnah. Okay, here we go. We got a bunch of Mishnahs in a row here, and we'll finish on time today. Habayre kitnius beyontif. Now we're talking about, remember, on Shabbos, there's the Isser of Boirer, separating. So I'll give you an example, okay? If somebody has laundry and you need your socks and it's mixed up in all the other laundry, you have to separate out the laundry one piece at a time. That's how you have to do it on Shabbos. You're not allowed to go ahead and separate out. Food works, you're allowed to do oichel mitoich b'soilus. You're allowed to remove the food, the good food, from the non-good food or the non-food that it's mixed up in. You're not allowed to remove the b'soilus mitoich oichel. You're not allowed to normally remove the no good from the good. You have to take out what you want and leave over what you don't want, as opposed to taking away what you don't want and leaving over what you want. That's what Shabbos. What's the rule on Yom Tov? Says our Mishnah. Habayre kitni is beyontif. If one has a mixture of beans with impurities, there's dirt, there's chaff, okay, and he wants to separate the legumes from the mixture on Yom Tov, the beans from Yom Tov. He separates the food from the impurities and eat it, just like Shabbos. You have to remove the wood, the food from the non-food. You have to remove the food from the impurities. Just like Shabbos, that's the way I remove it. I have to pick out the food that I'm going to eat and leave over the impurities. Beis Hillel on Yom Tov, different. Bayre kedarkai, you can separate it in the usual manner by taking the impurities from the food, by removing the non-food, the impurity, and leaving over the food. In his lap with a funnel or a large plate, but not with a board, a fine sieve, or a coarse sieve, because then it looks like you're acting professionally, because that's how they do it professionally, right? So that part I'm not giving you all the way, but I am allowing you more or less, according to Beitzah, to separate it the normal way. And in fact, not oichel mitoich b'soilus, not to remove the food from the impurities, but in fact, b'soilus mitoich oichel, you're allowed to remove the impurities and leaving the food on your plate. Rabbi Gamliel, he says, I'm going to give you even further. I'm allowed you to even rinse it and skim, because if you rinse it and you fill it up with water all the way to the top, the schmutz either rises to the top, the impurities rise to the top, and you can skim it off, or it goes to the bottom and you can get rid of it. And clearly, it sure seems that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel completely disagree with Rabbi Gamliel and say, that far, we're not allowing you to do it. Says the Gemara, we're now on 14b2. 14b2. Tanya, we learned, Rabbi Gamliel, where we saying this, where the food stuff is greater in volume than the impurities, so that taking the impurities from the food is the method that involves the least amount of toirach, the least amount of effort. But if the impurities by volume is much greater, is greater than the food that's actually there, everybody agrees that of course you should take out the food and leave the impurities, because this way, taking out the food is in fact the way of least effort. Says the Gemara, wait a minute, is that true? In a case where the psilus, the impurities, are greater than the food, is there anybody that says you're allowed to take out the food? What are you talking about? The food is prohibited to be touched. The psilus, by definition, right? The Pesoilus by definition is muksa because you're not allowed to use it. It has no use for you. Look at the Rashi, where it says Gemara, the second Rashi. That's in the skinny lines 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Even to touch them and move them. Because the minority, which is the good food, is completely swallowed up in the majority of impurities. And it's like the whole thing, because the majority is so great of impurities, it's like the whole thing is impure. So the whole thing is muksa. So how are you working this out? Says the Gemara like tzricha. The nafish petircha that we're talking about, we're taking out the impurities, involves a greater effort than taking out the food, but v'zutra b'shiura, but the amount of the impurities is actually smaller than the amount of food. In other words, there's actually more food than impurities, but the impurities are tiny. They're particles. Let's say it's dirt. It's a lot easier to take out the food, which is the more, than to try to take out the impurities, the tiny impurities, which even though they are less, is still much harder. In such a case, one should take out the food from the impurities. Rabbi Gamliel Oima, you could even rinse it and skim. Tanya, we learned. This was the minig of the house of Rabbi Gamliel. They would bring a bucket full of lentils. And they would float. They would cause water to float above it. In other words, they would add water to it until the level goes above the lentils. And they found that the food was on the bottom and the impurities, which were lighter, rose to the top. So then they were easily able to skim off the impurities. But Tanya, we have a Beitzah learned the others that they filled up the bucket with water and the food was actually rose to the top and the impurities fell to the bottom. Says the Gemara like Kasha. For the second case is when the impurities floated to the bottom, as we were dealing with earth. The impurities is dirt. Dirt that you make wet becomes heavy. It goes to the bottom. Habigile, the first one is dealing in straw. Straw is light. What happens is it rises to the top. Fine. Says the next Mishnah. We're not allowed to send matanos, presents, to our friends on Yontif. What presents are we talking about? We're talking about food. You want to send Jerry, wants to send Jeff, wants to send Jeff a whole bunch of food. Jerry is the connoisseur, and he goes ahead, he wants to send Jeff a whole bunch of food for Sukkot. Says Beishama, you're not allowed to, Jerry, elamonos, with the exception of ready portions. In other words, you have to portion it out, just enough food for that Jeff can eat it on Yontif itself, that there's not going to be any leftovers. Don't be ridiculous. Mishalchin, Jerry, you're allowed to send to Jeff. You're allowed to send the domestic animals and beasts and birds. Ben chayim, ben shechutim, whether alive, whether slaughtered. Mishalchin, yenoi, shemonim, usaloses, vikitnios. And you're allowed to send wine, oil, fine flours, and legumes. Avuloi tevua. But not grain, because grain can't be used on Yontif Bichlal, because grain has to be grinded, right? It has to be grinded up in order to create flour, in order to be used. Grinding on Yontif itself is not allowed. That's an issue d'oraisa. You should have prepared that before Yontif. You're allowed to use flour on Yontif, but you can't create the flour on Yontif. You can't grind it. So Jerry can send to Jeff everything, just not the raw materials that require processing because that can't be done on Yom Tov. And listen to this. Rab Shimon mata b'tavua, and Rab Shimon says amata because he says you can take the grains and cook them, and then after you cook them, they get soft. You can then grind them sort of in a small mortar, right? And get the stuff. It's not a problem. So says the Gemara. Tana Rabbi Yechiel teaches the Beitzah regarding Beis Hillel. You can send them all the presents, provided does not do it with a large party of gift givers. You can't make this obvious that you're trying to make sure that Jeff's wife doesn't have to prepare any food, not just for the first day of Yom Tov, but for all 7 days of Yom Tov. That you can't do. You can't make it obvious that you're giving him enough food that there's going to be leftovers for the entire Yom Tov. Tana, what's a large party? Ain't shura pesuchim mishloshim bnei adam. A large party does not consist of less than 3 people. If there are 3 men who mine with 3 different types of presents, each man carrying 1 present, 1 man carrying the fish, 1 man carrying the main dish, and 1 man carrying the dessert. What's the halacha? Maybe they're allowed to. They're looked at 3 individual people, or is it looked at as 1 large meal? Tekel, we don't know. We don't know. And the Rishonim argue about this. Do you look at them as 1 person and no good, or you look at them as 3 individuals? Now we finish up. Rab Shimon mata b'tavua. Rab Shimon permits grains to be sent. Tanya, Rab Shimon mata b'tavua. Rab Shimon allowed bringing grains. Kegoin chitim latzes behem ludiyos. For an example, wheat to make a wheat dish. Soirim litin uvnei behemtai, barley to place before his animal. Adoshim latzes behem resisin, or lentil to make groats. So those, it says Rab Shimon, you could do even with coarse grain. So therefore, you could even send over to Jeff the coarse grain. So Jeff is expecting that his wife doesn't have to do anything for Sukkot, that you're going to handle the whole business. Very good. We're stopping over here at the last Mishnah on 14b3. So let's just talk for a minute. Tomorrow, we're going to try to finish the Perek. Tomorrow is Daf 15. And we're going to try to start as well 15b. But 15b is kind of long. It's kind of long, and the next parak has a lot of halachas to it that involves Shabbos, Erev Tavshilin, and thing. We have a lot of explanation we got to do. So, bottom line is, on Yom Kippur, Thursday, we're going to go, all of us are going to go, okay? We're just going to find, let me find the spot to where we got to go. We're going to pick it up on Friday. We're going to pick it up on Friday. Everybody take a look. 16b1, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines from the top are 2 dots. We're going to start over there, even though it's really in the middle of a sugya. But what do you call it? Give me 1 second. You know what? Even better. We're going to stop right on top where it says Amar Rav Abba. That's where we're stopped. That's where we're going to pick it up on Friday. We're going to pick it up on Friday on Amar Rav Abba. So tomorrow we're going to learn. We're going to try to do the full daf tomorrow. And then on Yom Kippur itself, we'll only have to do like an amud, one side. But either way, on Friday, we'll pick it up on the top line of 16b.